If you're a public company, you have shareholders. Your shareholders need a factual assessment of where you are, not hyperbole. It needs to see a holistic picture of what you're up to. It needs to see new numbers. It can't see forecasts. It can't see exaggeration. It's got to be comprehensive, comprehensible. There's a very standard form because shareholders are entitled to that by our law. It makes sense. I am a shareholder. You are a shareholder. Your listeners are shareholders in the US, essentially. Government in the US, we are owners. And so where is the government speaking to us in that same that unemotional, straightforward way? And oh, by the way, when there's a 10K report that comes from a company, the CEO has to sign it and say, I have read this. This is accurate. I believe in the people who wrote it. And that's a baseline. You can't deny anything that's in that. We're the politicians sitting and signing something that says, these numbers I have read them and they are accurate to the best of my knowledge. Then all you're talking about is the future. You're not talking about what happened. You're debating the future. We live in a world today in which I don't think it's any surprise, a lot of our debate and discussion is not really grounded. And when I say facts, I was saying two things. What happened in the past, not predictions and forecasts. So I started trying to understand really what was going on with wealth transfer in the United States. Where was money coming from? What was it going to? Then I started thinking about, is government doing a good job? What kind of outcomes? Because government's not there just to, run a P&L. It's supposed to get better educated population, more jobs, et cetera. I said to myself, if this was like business and I was trying to learn about another company, I would go and grab their 10K report that they have to file with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which tells people about their business. No hype. You can't hype to the SEC. It's just got to be straightforward, just the facts. You can't show forecasts, just your own data. I thought that's really what I'd like. But there was no such thing as a 10K for government, let alone, and I'm not talking federal government, because you really have to put them together. If you ask me who built this street outside here, Century Boulevard, I can't tell you whether it was the municipal authority, some regional authority, the county, the city, the state. You need to put everything together if you want to look at spending and outcomes. And I said, I'm interested in this. I need to know this. I'm a citizen. About 86% of government spending goes into 8 areas. It goes into supporting people who are less advantaged financially, Social Security, Medicare, education, national defense, interest on the debt, and government employee retirement. And I only mention these things because some of them are in service of the future, but employee retirement is the past. And then crime. So those 8 things comprise 86% of government spending. And you can look at the detail, how much is going into each area. Okay, Social Security and Medicare, 26%. 18% in programs like Medicaid and SNAP and others that serve less advantaged people. And you can go look and say, okay, how many people are getting food stamp benefits? How much do they receive on average per month? There's a lot of consistency in some of that year to year. Now, obviously, we have a balloon of federal spending in the last couple of years. Federal government has transferred a bunch of that money to states and let states spend it. So we see that surge. We see that surge in government debt. Those things are obvious in the numbers. We see the surge in interest payments. Interest payments on the debt, I think, are up 87%, inflation adjusted versus 10 years ago. And Social Security and Medicare are only up 26%, just to give you context. And this is in an environment, of course, of low rates. As rates go up, if rates double, guess what happens? Over time, interest on the debt doubles. During the surge of the pandemic, you have some big numbers that were pumped into essentially transfer payments, cash transfer payments, not just to the disadvantaged, because much of these tax credits went to, for example, everybody with children, or most people with children. You see a surge in the number of natural disasters of cost over 10 billion. Interesting, affects FEMA. In the grand scheme of things, the amount of money that we spend on disaster relief is not big compared to a government budget that's now well over 6 trillion. When we started this process, it was about 5.7 trillion. And now we'll normalize with the new numbers. So it's small as a government spend item, but it is expanding in important ways, I think. The climate data we see has changed quite a bit. People can decide what they think of climate science, but there's no question in parts of the country it's getting a lot wetter, in parts of the country it's getting a lot drier. People can decide whether that relates to some of these natural disaster issues. Of course it's okay to have debt, but is it okay to keep taking more and more debt versus what we might even bring in tax revenue? Remember, our GDP is growing slower than our debt because we see debt increase as a percentage of GDP. Why do we all talk about GDP? Because GDP is kind of where you generate tax revenue. It's the thing that lets you pay down the debt. I mean, at some point, if I told you and it's not true today, but suppose I told you the biggest expense by our government in aggregate is paying interest on debt. Oh yeah, and then there's the school and there's a army and there's a bunch of other stuff. You might scratch your head and say, I'd like more of that to go into education. You might, or you might say, boy, the national debt these days is, $80,000 per person in the United States. You might say it's kind of like me leaving $80,000 of debt to every one of my family members. I sure hope over time they can bear the interest because they're going to have to pay it with their tax revenue. That's how I think about it. So the notion that debt can just keep going up faster, I think is a problem. Most companies have some responsibility to their lenders to keep some balance between their assets and what they owe. You can't borrow and borrow and borrow as a larger and larger percentage of what your company's worth. That's not allowed. In fact, the whole change in the banking laws from 10 years ago were designed to make sure that banks don't take on more debt than is safe. We have 330 odd million people in the United States. That's also a big number. So if you had, let's call it 33 billion being sent to the Ukraine, well, what is that? That is about $100 per American. You could say, hey, is that a lot or a little? But it helps you get more context. If you say 33 billion, the next question you might ask is, what do we spend in total on our own military? Well, we're spending 700 to 800 billion. I don't have this year's number on top of my head, but then 33 billion against 7 or 800 billion. And you say, okay, that's a decent sized percentage. I mean, it's about 5% of what we spend on our own military. Again, everybody gets to make their own judgment, but those are techniques I use to think about large numbers, is to try to personalize them, make them more individual, like the debt. And how much debt do we hold per citizen, if you will?